Welcome to Lucid Horizon. This is a program by IDEA TV, a weekly program dealing with critical issues of international nature, as well as their implications on the Iranian problems. In this program, we have a new participant, Professor Susan Abadian, whom I'm going to introduce and ask her to say a very short bio about herself, her work in the past, and how her expertise is related to the topic of our today's conversation, which is perspectives to liberation. Dr. Abadian, please say hello to our audience and say a 2-minute short bio about yourself.
Thank you, Professor Kangarloo, for inviting me to be here in this conversation. It's really an honor to be with both of you. I'm really looking forward to this engagement. My training is originally in international development. So I have several graduate degrees from Harvard University. I have both a master's degree in anthropology, cultural anthropology, as well as a master's in public administration with a focus on economic development from the Kennedy School, and a PhD in political economy and government. So the way that I came to the topic we're going to be discussing today is that I wrote my doctorate, my PhD on Native American communities in the US and Canada. So First Nations communities, looking at poverty and why the larger question was why certain communities are stuck in cycles of poverty and violence. And as I've explored it overseas, but I wanted to look at it closer to home in the US and Canada, and I discovered that the historical traumas, when I went into the communities and researched, I discovered that the historical traumas were continuing to interfere with economic and political development. So I got very interested in what trauma is, and even though I didn't have a background in psychology at the time, I started to look at this issue of how trauma, both at the individual level, but when trauma continues over generations, it can become embedded in culture and transmitted. Some of the dysfunctions become institutionalized and transmitted over generations as well. And so the outcomes are deleterious. They're negative, both for economic development as well as for political development, for democracy formation. So that's how I got interested in trauma as a subject matter. And as part of that, I think what we've discussed that you were interested in, I mean, trauma has multiple repercussions and implications for people and for communities. One of which is that when people are traumatized or have experienced trauma, it erodes trust in themselves, trust in other people, trust in authority structures, institutions. And so this mistrust is actually one of the obstacles to democracy. You know, you have to trust. You have to trust one another to be able to engage economically, but also you have to trust the authority structures to be able to engage democratically. So, and you've got to trust the political system. You've got to believe in public good, and all sorts of civic values that are eroded when we have a traumatized community. And as part of that, part of the implications of trauma on the individual level is one of the concepts you and I have discussed before, is this concept of learned helplessness that you wanted to bring to the awareness of the audience here.
Well, thank you very much for that very comprehensive introduction and your background. We also, in this program, we have Professor Houshang Amirahmadi from Rutgers University, distinguished professor from Rutgers University, with a very decorated and long history of teaching political science and actually practicing political science. He's been very active in the US-Iran relationship, and he's been in communication with various administrations in this country. And I would like to welcome Professor Amirahmadi to the show, and you can say a greeting to our audience. I think your microphone is muted. Okay.
Thank you, Professor Kangarloo, for that kind introduction. And I say hi to Susan, Dr. Abadian. And you know, as I was listening to her, I have to say that our background is almost 99% similar in education. I have also a doctorate in international development from Cornell University. I have written extensively on political economy. The last book of mine is The Political Economy of Iran Under the Qajar. And of course, my practice is development. And I take a very particular perspective on development, which is a bit different from what Dr. Ibadia brings to this field. And that makes me very interested in her discussion because I am always looking for a complement to what I know, and I'm sure I will be enriched by her take on development and particularly the issue of the role of trauma in development process, and in fact maybe in the development process.
Yes.
Okay, as opposed to development process. But I also believe that that in the course of a change, nations at times become traumatized. That very change is sometimes a bit traumatic in many ways. Change is traumatic. It's not something normal. It's not like a linear process. It has the ups and downs and below. So I think it is. I think it is important that we understand what it is that we are talking about in terms of like how do we change countries. You know, I think I take the perspective that development is part of what we used to call or do call nation building. That nations that really haven't really become nations or are nations that are not developed. Development is a major dimension of nation building.
Well, I'm glad you used the magic word, Professor Amir Ahmadi. You used the word complementary. You said your expertise in political science and economic development is complementary to that of Professor Dr. Abadian's. So today I want to look at the problem of development and the nations who, I mean, first of all, I don't understand why should nations who are walking in the path of development, why should they be traumatized? What's the role of trauma in development? And is there a barrier against development which acts as the agent of traumatization and then therefore it makes the issue of learned helplessness an irrelevant topic of conversation? Professor Abadian, could you say a few words about how nations in the process of development run against a barrier or in the form of dictators or poverty or war or geopolitics, and then in the process they become helpless and they become traumatized, and then their expertise is really empowering these nations through the understanding of the issue of learned helplessness?
I was really exploring nations and communities that came out of a history of colonization. So they had historical traumas already, they'd experienced it. And I saw how those histories carry through to the present day. And so really I was looking at societies that had already experienced traumas that had not been metabolized. We can talk about trauma as almost like nutrients that need to be, emotions that need to be metabolized that are not metabolized properly. And that can, and depends on the severity of the trauma. I mean, I think change can be traumatic, and trauma in itself doesn't have to lead to horrible outcomes over time. I mean, trauma can be a source of growth. There's a term called post-traumatic growth, meaning that people can use trauma to actually expand and grow and evolve into higher forms. So trauma in itself is not necessarily, you know, something. It's a fact of life. For I think being on the earth, you know, trauma is partly part of the package, right? But, so it just depends on the trauma. And what I write about is that there are different kinds of collective traumas. There are also more extreme forms, less extreme forms, and so again, depending on the severity. And I have a whole framework about how, how depending on the severity, and that there's certain factors that relate to that. The more severe forms that continue over generations, that disrupt various very important institutions like child rearing or spiritual, values, healing capacity, that these very extreme forms of collective trauma then can continue to reverberate in the society. So it's not all trauma, right? There are even different kinds of traumas to a collective. I'm talking about collective trauma. So trauma to groups and large groups. So the kinds that I studied, so for example, the tribal communities in the US and Canada, indigenous communities in general, were subjected to multiple generations of trauma that continued, that destroyed their way of life. So the changes were huge. And also the policies that were implemented, for example, residential boarding schools in the case of tribal communities, where they were by force, their children were taken away and put into residential boarding schools where they were Christianized. But in many of these schools, they were also, many of the kids experienced abuse. They were separated from family. They were shamed for their culture. Anyway, there's a lot of, systematic abuse, so that over several generations of these schools, the family started to deteriorate. The spiritual traditions started to deteriorate. Children were punished for speaking their native language. So there's a lot of trauma that reverberated and still continues to reverberate in those communities, and injustices that still continue. So anyway, the communities I studied were, histories of deep colonization that are continuing that are continuing. So it's not like development has its own traumas because there's change, is what I think Professor Amir Ahmadi was saying. But I'm not talking about that level of trauma. I'm talking about really deep, long-term changes that took place in some of these communities. So those communities I was observing had, one of the concepts, I don't know if you've discussed with other panelists around economic development. I remember hearing one of your esteemed colleagues talk about development, and he was talking about the factors of production, basically human capital and physical capital. I don't think in that conversation he talked about social capital, which is a very important, I think, having worked with Bob Putnam at Harvard or learned from him, he coined that term social capital. And he in his study with Italy, he wrote a book called, I think it was called Making Democracy Work. And it compared basically Southern and Northern Italy. So basically the same country, but different parts of the country. And he described how the North grew better, had higher economic growth, and also stronger democratic institutions as compared to the South. And he connected it to social capital, the existence of networks of relationships that exist, associational ties, as well as civic values. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is because trauma actually erodes social capital. It destroys the trust and the civic values that we have. We stop trusting each other when we're traumatized. We stop trusting authority structures. The civic values erode, and we don't gather together in healthy associational groups anymore in the same way. So, that's, anyway, that's how I've argued. Neo-institutional theory and social capital theory are ways I've argued to economists and to political scientists about the importance of trauma and why collective trauma is important to look at.
Professor,
I don't know if I answered your question.
Sure, yes, absolutely, beautifully. Yeah. It's actually, I'm going back to that issue of complementarity of your expertise and Professor Amir Ahmadi's expertise. So Professor Amir Ahmadi, Dr. Abadian is telling us about a particular type of trauma, which basically has roots in history. And this kind of trauma, she believes that, and her actual research shows that it erodes social capital, a term that I would like to expand on to see how social capital can be converted to other forms of wealth in a society. So your work is different. You have done trauma the way that in a more limited historical sense, the way nations are traumatized and how this kind of trauma can really block their nation's path to development, and primarily bringing democracy to countries. You've done a lot of work in in reconciliation between the United States and Iran. And your philosophy in doing that is that through relationship with the West and primarily with the United States, nations can develop. And no nation has ever been able to develop without direct communication or direct formal relationship with the United States. Could you say a few words about that and how that complements Dr. Abadian's expertise?
That is how the relation between US and Iran complements this argument?
You have advocated a relationship between US and Iran in order to take Iran beyond the trauma of Islamic revolution, right? And in the process of bringing democracy to Iran, you consider that to be the best approach. And that's quite different from what Dr. Abadian said. Could you please elaborate on that philosophy? And then we are going to go back to Dr. Abadian to see how the trauma, the present trauma that the Iranian nation is experiencing now can benefit from her expertise.
Yeah, thank you. I don't think that our approach is really different. There are two different dimensions of that same issue. I think Professor Abadian looks more into the inner tensions of the development. That is, I think her professor was Amartya Sen, I believe, and I can see that influence, and that he believes that the development means capacity building. It means, bringing people to enjoy life, to overcome problems, to become independent, take action in life. So development doesn't mean just adding more to the GNP, to the per capita, or more education and so on. Although for Professor Sen, education is a factor in capacity building and a very important. So I think, I believe there are two sides to development. There is this physical side, and there is this non-physical side. I don't think that's a spiritual or whatever. It is just a non-material side, perhaps. It's the psychological. I don't know what. On the physical side, of course, people need their basic needs to be provided and secured. If you don't have food on your table, if you don't have a house to live in, if you don't have a good health system to take care of you, you obviously become traumatized, using Professor Abadian's term. Traumatized, to become traumatized, there are so many things that could happen to you to become a little bit different from what an ordinary people, if there is an ordinary people, could become. So again, so you need certain level of physical development, and I also have to say that that I always keep saying to myself, to my students, to my colleagues, that every society that you look into is a society, whether we like it or not, whether we are Marxist or not, we are left or not, it's a class society. It's a society of different groups or classes of people. There are the poor people, there are the middle class, there are the upper class, and they are traumatized differently. They are traumatized by different factors. That is, there are different, I don't know if a billionaire is traumatized in the same way that a poor person is, and that the chance of his traumatization is the same as the one that is in the lower end of the society. So, a poor person could be easily traumatized by the fact that, he can think like in the afternoon, what he's going to do for his kid or his wife or the family, as opposed to the billionaire who is perhaps traumatized by making more money, who had to she'll be the competitor. So people are, but the bottom line, I think in development process, you need to have certain minimum level of physical development. Your basic needs to have to be secure. And those basic needs, again, is different from different classes of society. For a poor person, for a middle, the basic needs is your food, your work, your house, your education, your health, those minimums. And then for the middle class, that is, democracy, freedom, human rights, and you name it. I mean, that's what the middle class is about, because middle class usually has that basic common. For the rich person, none of this is an issue. Neither democracy is an issue, because they are free. In a society that the class society, the upper class is always free, almost always. Okay, and their problem is how to accumulate more, how to make more money, how to save the capital, how to secure whatever they have gained, and how to use that, perhaps for those of who are benevolent, to make the society better.
So you believe that the precondition for social development is actually economic development and enrichment of countries, teach them the capabilities of creating wealth. And once wealth is created, then the nations have gone beyond certain level of trauma, and then social development can be the natural consequence of economic development. Dr. Abadian, you have a more historic perspective to this issue. You talk about the Indians and the Native Americans, and the experience that you had in the reservations, and you had some experience with the Native Canadians, I assume, and you have been able to actually explore your ideas and your hypothesis about the empowerment by telling them that this degree of helplessness that you're experiencing is not an eventuality, and it's something that you've learned through historic means, and you can use that approach to empower them to go beyond that state of helplessness.
Yeah, and I just want to say that these ideas are not, even though they came out of my work with Native communities in the US and Canada, they're applicable to some contexts in Africa and Asia, other places. It's not like it's just about the tribal communities, obviously. They were, the whole discussion of economic development, we could just spend the whole hour talking about that. I don't think we want to do that necessarily, but and I don't want to, I just want to just, if I may correct Professor Amin Ahmadi, because trauma, we're using it very broadly here. And I don't think, we can't say everyone's traumatized even at the higher, trauma is really, let me just define it so that people can see. Trauma is experienced when you're feeling held captive in a situation where there's, some kind of threat, some huge threat to your life, or something that you hold very dear. So, someone who you're saying is wealthy and is traumatized by, I don't know, competitive things, that's not trauma, that's stress. So we may all feel stress, but when stress becomes traumatic, it actually has physical repercussions as well as emotional repercussions. So I just want to make sure that we're not, using trauma very loosely, because it is actually very different. And I think your point is really well taken, that in Iran, the economic pressures on people itself can be traumatic, and poverty and the violence or the levels of uncertainty that are being experienced feel threatening to life for a lot of people. I would imagine. I don't know what's going on in Iran as well as I should, and one would need to study. But those learned helplessness, I think maybe we should just introduce this to the audience, because we've talked about it before amongst us privately. But if I may just talk about this concept of learned helplessness, it's really originated with the work of Marty Seligman, this professor of psychology who's was well known for this concept that he coined, learned helplessness. And he worked with animals. He worked with dogs, and he ran experiments, for example, with 2 sets of dogs. And in one set of dogs, both sets of dogs were receiving moderate shocks. one group of these dogs could always avoid the moderate shocks by jumping over a barrier where they were confined. So they were actually confined to a space. They were held captive, as I said, and they were receiving shocks, like we can imagine as traumatic shocks. But they were able to jump over a barrier and escape these shocks. And you know, they had very little repercussions over time. But there was another group of dogs that he kept that were experiencing these same shocks, but they had no barrier they could escape. They no matter what they did, no matter however they tried to run away from the situation, they couldn't avoid it. They were definitely held captive, receiving shocks. And that set of dogs, as a result, had actually physical, chemical reactions to the experience, as well as what he coined learned helplessness. And the reason why he coined that term is eventually he removed that second group of dogs and put them in the same position as the first group, where they could escape the shocks. But because these dogs had been habituated and socialized into believing they could never escape, even though they had an escape group, they didn't escape. They would just continue to be shocked and would huddle in a corner, for example. So that's what he termed learned helplessness. And so he applied it to human beings and said, even as human beings, now trauma has multiple, people react differently to traumas, but this is one reaction, is to learn that you can't escape it. And therefore, even sometimes when there's a solution, you don't escape it, even if there's a solution, because you've learned helplessness. So that's what that term implies.
So is that correct to say that inaction is a consequence of learned helplessness?
It can be. You know, sometimes stillness is a good thing, but
right.
but I think inaction, as in apathy or hopelessness, or you know, just not acting in the world, not feeling like it'll make a difference if you act in the world. That can be definitely a reaction to trauma.
So Professor Amir Ahmadi, do you, taking the explanation and the description of helplessness and learned helplessness, do you think that in today's Iran, the people of Iran have been accustomed to this state of helplessness, and this question that is running around, you know, circulating in the opposition, asking, you know, opposition to, and this is actually a very hotly debated issue that the opposition forces are asking each other, why are Iranian people not doing anything? The same nation that rose up in a revolution and overthrew the Shah's government, how come they've become so complacent? Do you think this is a sign of helplessness if we judge it by inaction, or are there other political and economic and other forces at play that has created this kind of, I don't want to call it apathy, but lack of action?
Yeah, I don't believe Iranians are in the state of inaction. There are lots of actions have been doing that. We Iranians are, historically speaking, very revolutionary. We have made many revolutions in the last 120, 30 years. We have had several revolutions, or at least, you know, social movements of significant you know, nature. Let me put it this way. I mean, I think starting with trauma, there are, of course, there is the trauma at the level of individual and the trauma at the level of nations. I think, of course, the individual, the sum total of individual traumas could be the national trauma, but I believe the national trauma is much bigger than that sum total. Okay, because the national trauma really is an historical experience, and the individual is only 100 years to 80 years, 70 years. They go, come and go. Nations have 3,000 to 4,000 years of civilization, and they have, Iranians, for example, have had at least for the last 1,400 years, have been extremely traumatized by external forces. You know, Iranian lost to the Arabs, they lost to the Mongols, to the Seljuk, the Turks, to Afghans, to Russians, to British, and to Americans. We have been losing and losing.
We've lost to everyone.
Huh?
We've lost to everyone.
That's right. No, we were a loser. We have been a loser country for 140 years. Throughout that period, only a few times we won. One was Nader Shah going taking over India, and then a few times during the Safavid time. But generally speaking, 90% of the time, Iranians have been losers. And when you are a loser, you become a victim. You are victimized. And when you are victimized, you become traumatized. But in this time, as a nation, you become traumatized. Because individual people, yes, they were traumatized when the Arabs took over, but they are done. They're finished. Those traumatized people don't exist. But the history exists for the nation of Iran. It's still Iranians, when they see Arabs, they go back to the history 1400 years to remember what the Arabs have done to them. Of course, they haven't done to that person that he's talking about because he didn't exist then. They did to someone that of his or her brother or sister 1400 years ago. But that is the national trauma I'm talking about. That national trauma really has significant impact on the capacity of people to develop, to become active, to become proactive, to take action, to become innovative, inventive, and so on. They gradually, the helplessness, hopelessness, and all kinds of stuff develops. But one of the biggest secrets of Iran is that despite all this losses and despite all of this trauma over the centuries, it has had a tremendous staying power. I always, people tell me Iran had lost. I say, yes, Iran had lost, and I know that. But you tell me, where are the winners? Where are the winners? They have gone. Where is Sparta? Sparta, those 300, the movie 300. The guy comes and says, we 300, defeated an army of 10,000, Persians. I said, okay, right. But where are the Spartans today? They don't exist. But the Persians are here. So I think what I'm saying is that Iranians have a way of learning from their history and in fact coping with trauma in a different way than they have been. And I think Iranians even today, at the same time that they are traumatized, but at the same time they have not given up. That's the point. Like on the US-Iran relation we spoke, you asked, I've been there for 35 years trying to mend this relationship. That's been very tough. I mean, I can see, throughout this period, my experience was very interesting. I saw a nation that both wanted to bend relations, but at the same time was frightened by it. Somehow, it couldn't make up its mind which way to go. Yes, I want that relationship, but the minute the relation comes closer to some kind of a peace, they walk away. No, there is something wrong there. Again, that is back to the history. Unfortunately, the 19th century Iran was a bad Iran. I mean, not that Iran was bad. I mean, the whole situation, was bad in the sense that this was the century that so-called foreigners began entering and penetrating and invading the country in a modern way, in an advanced way. The British and the Russians, what they entered Iran very differently than the Arabs did. And Arabs came with swords, but British didn't come with swords. They came with economy. They came with politics. They came with all kinds of policies, and they came to corrupting the elite, the political elite in the country, subjugating them to their wishes and so on. Again, so that was a very bad period for Iranians, and that's in my book I very clearly demonstrate that Iran had more industries back in 1830s than it had in 1930s. For that 100 years, from 1830s to 1930s, Iranian industry dropped this way. You see, now you ask what happened. Well, you can see there are two forces out there that are doing it, the foreign forces and their domestic, helpers or servants or whatever, the elite, from the king down to ambassadors, I don't know what. So again, this experience, this Iranian experience with their own contemporary history is a better history. That they have tried a few times the tobacco movements. I started with the Babi movement, the tobacco movement, then the constitutional revolution, then Mossadegh movement, the nationalist movement, the Reza Shah's Iranist movement, and then this Islamic revolution. Throughout all of this, it's funny, Iranians have always been trying to locate their identity, and so then they can use that identity to move forward. Reza Shah will look for, 2,500 years ago, okay, and see what's going on, what happened there, what he can learn from them. And then Khomeini comes and says, the first 1,500 years is irrelevant. Let us start with Muhammad and see what we can learn from them, okay, and that will move us forward. But anyway, so to make a long story short, unfortunately, Iran is a traumatized nation. I think that for Iran, national trauma is much bigger than the individual trauma, which exists. I have to say.
So you claim that the record of action by the Iranian nation that you just counted, at least for the last 110 years, major revolutions, major upheavals, major social uprising, is an indication of action, and that indication of action contradicts the state of helplessness. Dr. Abadian, do you? Okay. Did you want?
I don't think that. I mean, Dr. Abadian can explain this better, but I don't think that in action, لزوما is
necessarily, yes. It's an easier word for you.
I said what I'm saying is that, yes, this is not an inaction in the sense. Maybe, you cannot always be in action. That's crazy. I mean, not even our individual. I sometimes sleep. I take time, take a drink and get a cigar, sit down and enjoy it. I don't always run after, life. Iranians, as a nation, perhaps that's what they are. They also, as a nation, have the right to relax and to be inactive.
That's right, yes.
Not to always be in the streets and fight the regime. It comes. I believe, I tell you, this regime has no way to run away from the Iranian people. Right. No regime has been able to run away from the Iranian.
Right.
They are
your point is well taken. Your point is well taken. So
the last point I wanted to make is on the social capital. I think it's a very, very important concept. In fact, in my development theory, I also have added something called territorial capital on the top of the social capital. The social capital is trust system, all of this stuff. And the territorial capital, which we often ignore, is the capital of a community. The social capital is part of it. It's part of the territorial capital. And every little society or a small society, big society, it doesn't matter. You have that territorial capital, very unique to that territory.
Yes.
For example,
the
Rashidis, Gilanis are very expert in silk production.
Mm-hmm.
The Kashanis are good in terma or in carpet, like Tabrizis are in it. And these are territorial capital. That is territorial expertise and history, extremely important. Iran has a history as a nation, but believe me, every part of that nation has its own history.
Right.
History
right. and expertise and industries, and yes, that's true.
Iranis have a completely different experience with Arabs than, for example, Khuzis have, or I don't know, Mashhadis have.
But going back to the issue of helplessness, from the account that you just gave us from the contemporary history of Iran, Dr. Abadian, based on that, at least that short account of the last 110 years and 4 major upheavals in Iran, does Iranian community qualify for a traumatized society? I mean, judging by the actions that Professor Amir Ahmadi just gave us an excerpt of those major upheavals, I suppose you don't take Iran as a nation under trauma.
Learned helplessness is a term you got very interested in.
Yes.
Also, but it's not the defining, it's not a defining characteristics of trauma. I think the description that Professor Amir Ahmadi had of Iranians wanting a relationship with the United States, but then being afraid, that describes to me, to some extent, a trauma response. So it's not learned helplessness. I mean, I work on the level of institutions and narratives. So, the narratives that come from historical traumas, that make people mistrustful of the United States, or, we can't trust the West, we can't trust America, we can't trust Britain, or all these kind of these are very trauma-laden, the conspiracy theorists. We saw it in the United States itself. These are trauma-laden, trauma-based perspectives and filters. And that's what I'm interested in. Learned helplessness is one piece of many possible outcomes of trauma. But anyway, so part of it is that people coming to the table to negotiate. I mean, I've worked with Palestinians and Israelis, 2 very traumatized groups, and they don't even see each other clearly. They're just working through these very damaged filters and coming at each other from these filters. So they can't even hear what the other has to say. They don't trust each other. And I think Iran also, is part of its diplomacy has to consider these sorts of implications, the trauma implications, so that one could actually work through them, build, trust in a different way, bring the elephant into the room. I mean, people aren't talking about these issues. People are not talking about, if they understood trauma and were able to, bring it into the room, I think it would be actually helpful in diplomacy.
Yes, I mean, that the comparison between the conflict between Palestinians and Israelis and the fact that they came very close to peace, a decent, peaceful arrangement, and then one party or the other walked away. The 1993 was a perfect example of that, and that saga is still ongoing, and the peace is still far from reach. And but back to Iran's problem, so you don't see the distrust between the Iranian government, the Islamic Republic, and the United States necessarily as a source of conflict, because Dr. Amir Ahmadi had some experience of bringing 2 governments together, and then at the last minute they walked away. And Professor Amir Ahmadi believes that this walking away from a peaceful arrangement is a distrust of the other side, or is it an addiction to the state of helplessness and the familiar conditions under which they have been living for a long time? I don't know whether, from all these issues that we're talking about, we can find a golden recipe to help Iran and US to go beyond this condition. What do you think, Professor Amir Ahmadi?
Yeah, that's let me give you perhaps an example on the US-Iran relation that solved this. I mean, first, as I said, US-Iran relation, both sides, to my surprise, for 40-some years in the relationship, have always seen that both sides wanted to settle with no war, no peace. I mean, any time we went to the side of the peace, someone walks away, and when we go to the side of war, they still walk away. No war, no peace for them is the best option on the table, and they have all of the players in this relationship have tried to maintain, to keep that the status quo. And the second issue I wanted to say is that the US-Iran relation, just like many distrustful relationships, is locked in locked up in what I call a spiral conflict. But a spiral conflict, I mean a conflict that no matter what you do, it spirals up. Let me give you one example. A few American generals once approached me and said, Dr. Emil Ahmadi, why don't you go and talk to the Iranian generals and have us meet, and we can make an agreement which is called the Incident at Sea Agreement, meaning that the two armies, let's say, in the Persian Gulf, will not accidentally get involved in a war. Americans were very much interested in having that agreement with Iran. And I thought that's a great idea. In fact, that was also an agreement that the United States had with Russia and a few other countries. It's called Incident at Sea Agreement. So I took the idea to Iran, and I convinced some of the Iranian generals that that's a good idea. They said, okay, we will take this idea to the higher up and see what happens. It went all the way to Khamenei. Okay, and then you know what Khamenei's response was? Very interesting. He said, they have sent us a message saying that they want this Incident at Sea Agreement so that we don't incidentally or accidentally get into a war. That's the trick that Americans are playing us. That's dishonest. You know what they wanted to do that? They wanted to do it because they wanted to keep their mind off the war in the Persian Gulf, so that they can sanction us more and more. You see what I'm saying? Indeed, I knew for a fact that Americans were honest and sincere, that they didn't want a war with Iran and the Persian Gulf. But Khamenei took it a completely different way. This is just a trick. That's dishonesty. What they wanted to do is to sign this agreement with us so that they are completely comfortable with that side, and their mind is off that war, so that they can go and sanction us. So that is what we call even good intentions.
Very imaginative.
In a spiral conflict is considered bad, and it ratchets up.
But this is the point. I know we're coming to an end, but this is where the personal becomes political, because I don't know what his history is, but the guy clearly has a very distorted filter. He can't trust. He's cynical, and these are hallmarks of trauma. I mean, people who have experienced trauma are like what you're describing. They cannot believe that people can be trustworthy. So to me, that's where the personal is political. And we have leaders in Iran misleading. They're not really leaders, people in positions of authority who are traumatized themselves, who are misleading our country. And that's part of the problem as I see it.
So as an expert, you are diagnosing Mr. Khamenei with a historic trauma that is really preventing him from making an amicable peace with the United States, or not even peace, amicable arrangement to prevent some incidents at sea.
Exactly.
Yes.
I mean, people diagnosed Trump as well. I mean, trauma shows up in different ways. People who are traumatized can be disempowered, and they can be falsely empowered. I mean, Trump, for example, represented the falsely empowered. He was grandiose and arrogant, and I mean, these are all also hallmarks of trauma at times. So, I mean, I don't want to diagnose anyone. I don't know these guys. I don't know Khamenei's history. I don't know these people's histories, but I imagine that we've done research, political research, and political psychology, where there's demonstrated that people who are much more conservative and cynical tend to come out of family backgrounds where they were beaten as children, had very authoritarian fathers. And so there's a link. I mean, we try to say, oh, this is, trauma is just on the individual level and it doesn't have that much impact, but it actually has big impact. We have, white supremacy, a lot of white supremacists, when I was working at the State Department, I worked in the field of preventing violent extremism. A lot of violent extremism is related to histories of trauma. And we don't, it has to do with family, systems and family. So these things are all linked. It's not, they're very important. What happens in the family, how we raise our children, the relationship between a husband and a wife, how the father is, if there's physical violence and harshness and authoritarianism, that affects the child. And when they become an adult, it depends if they've handled the trauma. If they have not resolved the trauma, they live this out, continue to live this out with distorted filters. So that's what I'm hearing, what you're saying about Khamenei and others. I'd be very interested to know how they grew up. What was their life like?
Well, he was a political prisoner. He was a political prisoner.
So
so what you're saying is that it's not just the victims which are traumatized, the people who are disempowered, but the people in the position of power could also exhibit some behaviors of consequence of trauma.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, trauma, as I said, can show up as being people who are traumatized can oftentimes feel victimized, but they also can be perpetrators. The perpetrators, our prisons are filled with perpetrators who have committed acts of violence because they feel entitled to do so.
Yeah.
They think they're entitled. So someone who's in positions of authority, who feels entitled to, repress people and oppress people and throw them in jail, and usually their trauma, they come from a background of trauma. So it can show up in different ways, in other words.
So coming back to the topic of the conversation, which was perspective to liberation, I want to give each of you 2.5 minutes, that's all the time we have, to tell us if there is a liberation approach to liberation for people. Now, at the end of our conversation, we came to the conclusion that when we talk about Iran, we're talking about a nation that the people in power and the people outside power, the nation and the leaders, they're both traumatized, and they're perpetuating the trauma through their grievances that they are carrying against the government of Iran, is carrying grievances against the government of the United States and the Western world, and the Iranian people against their own government. So, Professor Amir Ahmadi, could you in 2.5 minutes tell us if there is a way out of this and there is an approach to liberation of Iran?
First, on the more psychological side and on the more scientific side of this drama, I will let the Professor Abadian speak. But let me make a comment on it a little bit differently on this issue. Honestly, perhaps I should acknowledge it's the first time that I started thinking like, instead of just going and telling people that Khamenei doesn't want US-Iran relation for whatever reason, perhaps we should really take a closer look at his personality, his experience, his history, and this is why Khamenei has taken the position on the US that he has. I mean, some people say, he's a lefty and is an anti-imperialist position. He's a pro-Russia, is the Soviet position. Is a religious position because he's an Islamic revolutionary and all that. But none of us really ever took a closer look at his life, his experience. Khamenei was a mullah, a third-rate, fourth-rate mullah, then suddenly was jumped into a revolution, a huge change in his life. I mean, I think that very change traumatized him. Many of these leaders, big time, many of them never, ever thought they would become leaders of a country like Iran. I mean, they were sort of like dropped into a particular situation. And that was by itself a huge traumatic experience for them. They were not just ready for the possessions they took. The presidents and vice presidents, ministers, God forbid what. They were not at that level. So that itself traumatized them. Okay, now Khamenei himself started his job, okay, in the war front, basically, in the war with Iraq. He used to put army, stuff, the uniform. And he was working with the Pasadaran and the guys at the front fighting Iraqis. And then Khamenei got a shot you know, it got.
We have 1 more minute, and I want to give that 1 more minute to Dr. Abadian.
His hands, sort of like, you know, huh?
We have 1 more minute, and I want to.
You know, that's what I'm saying is, if you look at Khamenei's experience, you will see that this man became traumatized in the course of the last, you know, 40 years in a very specific ways. You know, he was subject of a terror assassination attempt. He was in the war front. You know, all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
So I think the time has come for us to take a closer look at this man and to see why he developed the kind of idea that he has developed, became so cynical about the US.
All right. Thank you very much. Dr. Abadian, do you see a way for liberation, an approach to liberation for Iranian people, given that both nation and leaders are traumatized?
I do, and it's going to be a subject of another conversation because it's a long talk, but I will just say one sentence, that I know that all Iranian people, whether they're in positions of authority or they're feeling helpless, who are lower class, they all want the same thing. They want political and economic sovereignty. And in order to have economic and political sovereignty, it's personal sovereignty is required. They have to become free of these traumatic responses and filters. They have to see clearly what's possible. And that's what needs to happen. We need to have personal sovereignty as part of economic and political sovereignty. So that's what I argue for. And we can have another discussion about what that means.
And you believe that there is a way of gaining personal
sovereignty
before you gain economic and political sovereignty?
Alongside it, yes.
That's a fascinating. That's a fascinating concept, and it's fascinating. That would make the material for a fascinating conversation that we're going to have next week. And with that, I thank you both very much for participating in this very thought-provoking debate and conversation between the three of us. And once again, thank you, and hope to see you here next time to continue this conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you.